her yesterday, and I think she said that she had something to do today, so I'm not even sure if she's coming. Like
Okay.
another conference she was participating with.
I was the one person I wanted to be. No. All right. So we'll go ahead and get started. For the sake of time, we have about an hour. If everybody can keep their presentations to around 12 minutes or so, would give or take, that would be awesome. That way we could have some time to engage at the end. I am Periloux, Peay. I'm assistant professor of political science at Georgia State, and we are here to talk about institutions. So we're going to start off with a paper from Charlton, Copeland, Race, the Republican Party, and the Marketing of Voter Fraud. Take it away.
So good afternoon. I'm really excited to be here. I've been trying to get here for a while. I'm a law professor who stupidly decided to go back to school and get a PhD in political science. So this is part of my dissertation project. I teach mostly around issues around federalism and administrative law. So you know, I'm interested a lot in institutions, and I'm really interested in the question. I don't have slides, so I want to apologize. I came down with COVID like 2 years into the pandemic. I tested positive Wednesday, so I'm a little. I'm happy to be here, but I'm not well prepared, other than my paper. But I'm really interested in the question of, on some level, both why the Republican Party has sort of turned to voter fraud, but in some sense, how? Like, what are the institutional and ideological interactions and mechanisms that have made that possible? And what's the and I think that there's a sort of long history, that there's a history around conservative networks that have made that possible, that have made voter fraud legitimate for longer than we think, more broadly than we think within conservative issue networks, and I think that it has been made, again, longer than I think many people understand, more legitimate within and through bureaucratic institutional mechanisms, particularly the second Bush administration's efforts in the Department of Justice, and all of that, right, is in some sense carried on the back of race, and it's carried on the back of race, I argue, in two ways. That is, I think that it is carried on a kind of ideological conception of the criminality of Black people and Black voters, but it's also made easier by the racial segregation of the two main parties. That the simply the fact that we have in America a party of Blacks, the Democratic Party as it's currently constituted, and a party of whites, of the Republican Party as currently constituted, and the ease with which the racialization of voter fraud has happened. It happens in some sense because of that one cultural factor and two sort of structural feature of American political parties. And so I want to kind of give you a sense of where I think, in some sense, we began and where we've gone over, I argue, the last at least 30 years and longer even. But I want to pick up in some sense primarily on a kind of 30 plus year story that that again racialized the voter fraud, and then relied on these networks that I referred to earlier. And so one of the things that I think what was done, even in some sense before conservatives did it, that is to say, I think even political commentators who think of themselves as certainly not as Republicans and as and perhaps not even as conservatives, were making arguments that that suggested that the Democratic Party, in some sense, was in trouble. That its relationship with certain kinds of voters made it vulnerable. So in 1986, Virginia political scientist Larry Sabato and Wall Street Journal writer Glenn Simpson published a book called Dirty Little Secrets: The Persistence of Corruption in American Politics, in which they described the breadth of voter fraud and other forms of political corruption in American politics, particularly in a chapter called Street Money: Minority Votes for Sale and for Rent, ? In several reviews of that book, it was noted as, quote, the most sensational section of the book. Some of the claims that the book made were its focus on the extent to which the minority vote had become essential to the Democratic Party coalition, that effective mobilization of Black and other minority voters was essential to Democratic Party's electoral success, and that that this all often involved payments of tribute to ministers and other Black community leaders. Sabato and Simpson pointed to the budgets that exceeded what they thought of as excessive, exceeding $250,000 in Virginia for the Get Out the Vote campaign when L. Douglas Wilder ran for governor in 1989. They also focused on and racialized depictions of the what they again thought of as the Democratic Party's vulnerability to such corruption. They depicted Black communities as leeches off of the Democratic Party. They described that Democratic Party operatives were loath to speak about their need to pay street money in minority communities, quote, lest the vitally important Black leadership be alienated. And so there was this early discussion of the Democratic Party's vulnerability from even within the Democratic Party, that suggested that voter fraud was unique within the Democratic Party, in part because of their unique reliance on minority voters, and again, exercising and practicing tropes around Black criminality, right? Black people's propensity to engage in a certain set of practices that were untoward. They talk about they quoted a Democratic Party staffer on the ways in which these sort of street money practices got out of hand. In one part of the book, they said the word got out in the Black community that all you had to do to get $20 was to say you did some work. And before we knew it, the line of petitioners wound all through our building and out the door. We ran through $10,000 in 2 hours and had to lock ourselves into the office and hope people would drift away. Right? It's clear that these people who had to lock themselves into their offices were white Democratic Party operatives who were being besieged by greedy Black voters. And again, the sort of racial depiction of what fraud would look like. Again, the Help America Vote Act, otherwise known as the Motor Voter Act, right, also became a kind of basis for increasingly Republican Party efforts to depict an out of control voter fraud, particularly in cities like Atlanta and Philadelphia and Milwaukee, right? Again, predominantly minority cities in the 1990s, which we saw as the sort of first efforts. I want to then sort of move to thinking about the ways in which these depictions also played out across certain networks within conservative movements, from the Federalist Society's Free Speech and Election Law Practice Group to the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal. Through this time, you found increasingly players who called into question the integrity of American elections as early as the late 1990s and into the early 2000s. We all know that early attempts to delegitimize the Association of Communities for Reform Now, otherwise known as ACORN, had its roots in establishing ACORN's connection to voter fraud, again, particularly in minority communities. We saw, if you go back and look at programs of the Federalist Society's annual conference, you will see the likes of law professors, lawyers, party activists who would make their home in the Bush administration throughout the early 2000s, speaking about voter fraud at those national conventions. And then finally, as my time winds down, we saw in the Bush administration, and again, even a reprise of that in the Trump administration, efforts to embed those who had championed the voter fraud mythology into the civil rights section of the Justice Department, and to reframe its mission to try to employ the Voting Rights Act against voter fraud in an effort to protect the integrity of the ballots that had been cast by worthy voters, as it were. And so a complete attempt to bureaucratize a partisan reorientation of the Voting Rights Act and the mission of the civil rights section of the Department of Justice, again, during the Bush administration and during the Trump administration, shows us the way in which the party, again, engaged in a kind of racialized ideological set of moves, and then organizationally and institutionally engaged with conservative issue networks and the bureaucratic state to market and sanitize voter fraud.
All right, thank you so very much, Charlton. We're gonna move on to our next presenter, who is Karra McCray, my apologies, guys. Race, Caucuses, and the Progressive Agenda.
Yes. So let me move these subtitles from the bottom. Hello, my name is Karra. I'm a second-year PhD student at Brown. And I wrote this paper and see this paper as one part of a larger project for myself. So it's called Race, Caucuses, and the Progressive Agenda. So I had a link, but I can just, for the sake of time, I'll just summarize it. So in July 2021, Mehdi Hassan, who's a political journalist, interviewed Majority Whip Jim Clyburn, who is the highest ranking Black member in the House from my home state of South Carolina, about whether messaging and sloganeering around defund the police was damaging to the Democratic Party. And so Jim Clyburn basically said that in Jasper County, which is a county in South Carolina, that defunding the police is a non-starter among Black people. Yet the thing that surprised me the most is when he said, and I'll quote, let me remind you, if you're going to categorize left and right, I'm on the left of my party. Nobody can call me anything but a progressive, and I've been one all my life. I met my wife in jail being progressive. But yeah, this is contradictory of political newcomers like Representative Ilhan Omar, who like branded herself as a progressive and said that, defund the police is not just a slogan. Like this is actually a policy demand. And we see the same thing with Representative Cori Bush, who basically says the police as an institution exists to uphold white supremacy and that we must abolish it. So while Congressman Clyburn kind of sees himself as a progressive, it's like on the issue of police brutality, this law enforcement, there's no clear consensus from these Black representatives about what exactly is going on. We see what I see is this tension happening within the caucus. We see this again with the Build Back Better bill. The CBC is like, supporting Biden and for it, and then the progressives are hesitant, they're reluctant, they're like, we're not gonna support this. And so Speaker Pelosi sends the chairwoman, Joyce Beatty, and says, hey, I think you should go talk to the progressives. It'll be better. They'll receive the message coming from you as a Black woman. And she kind of makes this point, like, I'm trying to keep everyone happy here. I understand that there's a growing overlap between the two caucuses. And so those 6 progressive members, like who are members of the squad, they actually dissent from the party. And 4 of those are members of the Congressional Black Caucus, Representative Omar, Bush, Presley, and then Representative Jamal Bowman. So thinking of all these issues and thinking about after 2018, all these progressive candidates are running, they're actually saying that they're coming to change. They want to re-radicalize the CBC, like they're trying to challenge the status quo, what's going on. We see even people like Danny Davis has a progressive person running a challenger this coming election. And we see like Representative Bowman, who's like, the country is ready for this progressive change. And so it brought me to my research questions, like, are there ideological differences between members of the CBC and CPC? And if so, what are those differences? But then also, how has the ideology of both of these caucuses changed over time? And so like just a brief background. So the CBC was founded in 1971 to effectively advance the interests of the Black community. They had 13 founding members. Representative Shirley Chisholm was the only woman who was a part of this caucus, and they currently have a membership of 57. The CPC was founded 20 years later to kind of combat the growing inequalities within the Democratic Party. They had 6 founding members, and 2 of those members were also members of the CBC, and that's Representative Maxine Waters and then the late Representative Ron Dellums. And they currently have a membership of 96. So both caucuses are growing. The CPC, of course, is growing really fast. And I think of the 96, there's about 30% of the CPC members who are actually Black. And so the existing scholarship, one thing that we see is like a lot of the scholarship talks about the ideology of the caucus as a whole, whereas I kind of see and want to investigate the intra-caucus ideological differences and implications that may have not only for the Democratic Party, but even like the larger House of Representatives. And so one of the growing themes we have is this ideological cohesion. And so even in the formation of the CBC, there were some generational, some political differences, but even despite that, even despite the growing numbers, they have maintained this kind of, they vote cohesively is something that we see. Another issue, like Lucas and Dutchman had this article in 2002 that looked at like how liberal each of the caucuses were, and they found that the CBC was actually more liberal than the CPC. And so like thinking on this idea of this liberal policy record, we had Catherine Tate, who wrote the book Concordance in 2014. She had a new edition published in 2020. And she basically said like, hey, the new representatives of the caucus are not as liberal as the founders were. They are coming in, they're being co-opted by the system, they're voting in hand with the Democratic Party. And then we have Dr. Mike Mensah, who I think I saw you in the chat, who's like, actually, she gets it wrong. Like, actually, these Black members are more liberal, right? Like, let's expand what we look at. And he credits like Representative Sheila Jackson Lee and how she sponsored the reparations bill in the 116th Congress. Even think about like the vice president now, in quotes, Emmett Riley, who's like, yes, the CBC members are sponsoring legislation to kind of raise the minimum wage. They're looking at reparations they have this Safe Prescription Act. So they are doing liberal things. And so I wanted to like just do descriptives and say like who are these members who are not of the CBC, who are not in the CPC? Like, what do we see? Do we notice any trends here? And I see that there are 29 members of the 57 who are not members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. 17 of them are from the South, so that's like 59%. So it may be some regional things going on. 19 of them are women and 19 of them are men and 10 of them are women. So what I decided to do is I use this research design and I use the DW nominee scores, and I know that they have their own limitations and I speak of them. Some people use ADA scores, but they only use the 20. They only use 20 votes. And I use the DW nominee score because again, this is like a one branch of the 3 other things that I want to look at to examine this ideological differences. And so I look at it from the 109th to the 116th Congress. CPC membership could not be found prior to the 109th Congress. And also there's a professor, Jennifer Victor, who's at Mason, who shared her data set with caucus membership with me, and then some I was able to edit. So basically what I did is I grouped them. I have 4 different groups, only House Democrats, except for Mia Love, who was a member of the the CBC, although she's a Republican during her time in office. And then I grouped them by 1, members of CBC and CPC, 2, just CBC, 3, CPC, and neither being just the Democrats. And so we look at this first dimension, and what we see here is that, okay, both caucuses tend to be pretty liberal on economic issues. And of course, this dimension of the nominee scores are more precise. But when we look at this second dimension, which is more social issues, what we see is that we look at the CBC from 109 to like the 113th Congress, we see them becoming more conservative each year. And then in the 114th Congress, there's a very sharp curve signifying that the majority of the ideological differences align, scores of the members align there. But what we see is that in the 115th, 116th Congress, these curves are flattening, right? So the ideological diversity within the caucuses are expanding there. Meanwhile, if we look in comparison to the CPC, they seem to be getting consistently more liberal each year. And I know my time is running up. So quickly, so something that I found is that the CPC is the most liberal caucus, and it has been the most consistently liberal in looking at these years, but also that the ideological diversity within the CBC has also increased. And so like in conclusion, as the nature of Black representation, gets more complex in the 21st century, the Democratic Party becomes more ideologically diverse, the tensions between the CBC and CPC should either grow larger, or the CBC could eventually be co-opted by the CPC. Studying the role of these caucuses in facilitating representation for specific identity or ideological coalitions in Congress presents like this new window into effectiveness of representation in the House of Representatives. And so that's all I have like for this part, and happy to engage and answer any questions in discussion.
Awesome, great job, great job. We're gonna move to Chelsea Jones, Taking Back the Ballot, Black Socio-cultural Institutions and the Contemporary Fight Against Voter Suppression.
All righty, that is a hard act to follow. Awesome job, Karra. So I'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for having me. I'm Chelsea Jones. I'm a doctoral candidate at UCLA. And so my dissertation, which I have just begun, is evaluating the role of Black sociocultural institutions in maintaining Black political power amidst intense voter suppression efforts. And so today I'll present the research findings for one of the 3 empirical chapters of my dissertation, but of course you're welcome to ask about the other 2 during the Q&A portion of the presentation. And I look forward to any thoughts and feedback you have on my methodology and other considerations that aren't included in the presentation. So what we know about voting rights in the US is that there have been nationwide efforts to decrease access to the polls, and this has been done through a number of suppressive electoral policies since the Shelby County v. Holder court case. But despite these efforts, the data is showing us that Black voters have continued to turn out at rates that are higher than any other minority group, And while these rates can and really should be attributed to the Black community's sense of linked fate and their historic loyalty to the Democratic Party, I'm positing that one understudied explanation for high Black civic engagement within these constrained electoral environments is countermobilization by Black sociocultural institutions, such as the Black church and Black civic and community organizations. And so I'll bring you to a present day example of this phenomenon and one of the motivators for my study. In Texas, the case of Prairie View A&M University is a key example of the way that Black institutions are counter-mobilizing suppressed Black voters. Now, Prairie View is an HBCU that's located in a predominantly white and Republican county, which has worked to diminish the Black student vote for generations. And this county has used tactics like splitting the campus into multiple voting precincts, removing the polling station on campus, limiting early voting operations, all of these tactics to decrease the electoral power of Black voters. Now, despite these targeted and really persistent efforts, Prairie View and its many organizations have worked to counter-mobilize voters and reduce the cost of participation for them. And so this is evidenced by this map I created of Black voters and Black registration rates in each precinct. And so here you see the darker blue areas are going to represent precincts with high proportions of Black voters. And these larger red circles are going to represent higher voter registration rates. And so what we see here is that where this fundamental institution exists, registration is at its highest. However, in the surrounding Black precincts, registration is substantially lower. So this brings me to my two dissertation research questions. The first of those is what factors influence the effectiveness of Black sociocultural institutions in mobilizing Black voters against suppressive electoral policies. The second, which I'll be focusing on today, is to what extent do Black sociocultural institutions influence Black voter participation in jurisdictions implementing suppressive electoral policies. So I'll briefly go over some bodies of literature that I'm consulting with and expanding for this study. The first of those is the principal inquiry of what motivates individuals to participate in electoral politics. And this question is most often answered with rational choice theory, which is asserting that the decision to participate civically is coming down to that fundamental question of, are the benefits greater than the costs? And so studies show us that the costs and benefits are a function of many resources, educational attainment, socioeconomic status, to name a few. But for Black voters, we know that the decision to participate civically goes beyond an individual cost benefit assessment. We have theories of group consciousness and linked fate that suggest to us that Black voters are considering the communal benefits of voting through the lens of our shared oppression and shared status with other Black people. The literature also shows us that Black voters evaluate the cost based on the impact of voter suppression. We know that voters of color have been shown to be highly sensitive to restrictive voting laws, and thus were more impacted when these laws increase the cost of voting. Excuse me, my slide didn't change. So this brings us to the role of institutions in impacting the costs and benefits of participation. So as we've talked about today, political parties have been the original mobilizing institutions of American politics. And there was a time where these institutions used a deep knowledge of local conditions and local needs. However, they've since shifted to what Janelle Wong calls selective voter activation. And this is prioritizing mobilizing voters that are going to expand the party's electoral base. And so we know that for Democrats, this leaves very little incentive to appeal to Black voters beyond some of the symbolic efforts that we've seen. So the literature on community-based organizations, however, shows us that these types of institutions are filling the gap that is left by political parties. They provide channels of political socialization, they orient members towards political participation, they even foster racial and ethnic identity as an organizing skill while helping develop culturally relevant political agendas. And so in Wong's study of this, she's building heavily off of the resource model of participation, and that model identifies these types of institutions as places where voters are going to gain organizing and leadership skills that are critical to political participation. So while these models are foundational, they unfortunately don't fully account for the role of persistent, ubiquitous efforts to suppress votes that often occur before a voter decides to vote and even after a voter has made their way to the poll and faces barriers. And so quickly, I'll lay out a framework that I believe explains Black voter participation in these constrained electoral environments. So the central theoretical claim of my dissertation is that Black sociocultural institutions serve as cost-reducing mechanisms for Black voters. And I say that this happens in two ways. The first way is reiterating this long-standing resource model participation, which notes that Black institutions provide political resources that are critical for political participation. And the second way is my contribution to the literature. And this is an assertion that these institutions are employing cultural culturally relevant messaging and programming that is changing Black people's perceptions of the costs and benefits of voting, and thus pushing them to turn out to vote despite voter suppression. And so really quickly, I'll go over a chart that I developed to demonstrate how I anticipate this process working. It starts with a voter coming in contact with a socio-cultural institution with its programming and its messaging. And then the resource model participation tells us that this interaction is going to lead to increase in political skills and social capital and allow voters to contribute to the creation of a policy agenda. Now, thereafter, despite how effective mobilization might have been at that moment, voter suppression is working to have some form of impact on voters, particularly Southern voters, be it by poll closures, by long lines at the poll, purges of the voter rolls, many different things. And so this is where I assert that this messaging and programming of sociocultural institutions has an impact. It serves as a next layer of motivation for Black voters that pushes us beyond the obstacles placed by voter suppression. And then this results in voters committing one of many what I call counteractive political activities. These are actions like relocating polling locations or waiting arduous amounts of time to vote, or even mobilizing your families to vote by mail, which then contributes to high rates of civic participation. Unfortunately, I don't have time to get into the intricacies of this process, especially on the particular study that I'm presenting, but this will be followed through in the dissertation and other studies. So I'd like to highlight the two sociocultural institutions that my dissertation focuses on. First is what the literature calls political churches, and this is a subset of Black churches that have very salient political orientations. The second institution of focus is civic and community organizations, and these are organizations that are meeting essential and material needs and also serve as hubs of socialization for Black people. So now I'll discuss the way that I plan to explore this theory through my dissertation project through one of the studies. Just briefly, I've chosen the state of Texas as a case study site for my dissertation research, largely because of its recent passing of the most restrictive voter reform bill, SB 1, but for many other reasons that I'd be happy to expound on in the Q&A if you're interested. So my research designed to study countermobilization in Texas consists of a jurisdictional analysis, and this is analyzing the impact of sociocultural institutions on voter registration and voter turnout. And this particular study is taking into account the idea that the programming and messaging from these institutions may have spillover effects beyond a specific church or beyond a specific organization's targeted membership. So I'm using a list of sociocultural organizations that I'm developing, and I'll be comparing Black voter participation across multiple regional areas in Texas and taking kind of two approaches to do so. The first one is a traditional precinct participation analysis. I'll be assessing Black voter registration and voter turnout across precincts with over a 50% Black population. And then I'll be comparing rates by the level of countermobilization activity of Black sociocultural institutions in that jurisdiction. And so my assumption here is that voter participation is going to be higher in precincts that are in the service area of sociocultural institutions. And I'll be running a linear regression with turnout and registration as the dependent variables and with countermobilization activities as the independent variable. And so quickly, the way that I'm measuring countermobilization activity is 4 ways. First is a binary variable that identifies whether or not this jurisdiction has a physical sociocultural institution, because we know that a lot of these organizations are now digitally based. So we'll be looking at whether they have a physical one. Second is by tracking the number of voter registration drives in that area in the 3 months prior to the voter registration deadline. Third is by tracking the number of policy orientation events. And then fourth is by tracking the number of random voter activations. These are those that don't have a specific category, but their goal is to increase voter turnout. The second way that I'm going to measure this is by focusing on a geographical analysis, since I'll be looking at jurisdictions. And I'll create and geocode a data set of the voter activations that I talked about earlier. And I'll use this data set to draw maps that are going to demonstrate the relationship between the location of these types of events and activations and turnout and registration. And then I'll be utilizing county precinct shapefiles, turnout by precinct, and election results to show this. So lastly, I want to show a bit of the preliminary analysis that I've started with from 2020. I'll be focusing on the 2022 midterm in my dissertation research, but I wanted to go ahead and get started to show you all what this will look like. So to conduct this analysis, I utilized precinct demographic and election result data, as well as this data set of institutions in Dallas. This one only includes 3 because these are 3 physical institutions, and it's still developing. So the map on the left is showing you the 2019 Black citizen voting age population in Dallas County with 3 of the organizations, 2 mega churches and 1 community center overlaid. And so where you see the darker blue areas, this is going to represent high proportions of Black potential voters. And from this map, we can see that with these institutions, they're in areas that are over 70% Black. So any in-person mobilization activities that they put on are going to have direct impacts on the surrounding Black community. Now, this map on the right is reflecting 2020 voter turnout percentages in Dallas County precincts. And so where you see the darker red, this means a higher voter turnout. And this map illuminates a potential key finding, which motivates me to keep going. So where these identified institutions exist, turnout is hovering between 50 and 60%. However, as we move closer into the city center, where there's still a very high population of Black voters, turnout is decreasing into the 25 to 50% range. And so there's many ways that we could explain this shift. This could be because this area is lower income and lower access to transportation, but there are also lower mobilization efforts and fewer salient physical sociocultural institutions that service this region. And so this kind of motivates me to keep going, keep building this list and see what this relationship is. This map also shows us that turnout is higher in these southernmost precincts where there's very high proportions of Black people. There's also higher income Black people in these areas. So this kind of motivates me to expand my data set beyond the inner city and look into the suburbs where there are other proportions of Black people. Nonetheless, this is some exciting findings that are motivating me to keep going with this portion of the dissertation. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all for your time and very excited to hear any feedback that you may have about the study.
All right, thank you, Chelsea. And I really like that you did Prairie View in there for a little bit because I went to Prairie View for a very brief time. So
okay.
And what I also want to do is invite you all to put any questions or comments that you might have in the chat because I don't know if we might be running up against the deadline because we have like 6 papers to present in this panel. So if you have questions, go ahead and start throwing them in the chat, and that way the authors can respond in the chat if we don't have enough time for that. So apparently I'm up next on the agenda, so I'm going to go ahead and share my stuff. Actually, it's not letting me share mine. So I'm going to let Isabelle go while I figure out what's going on with this.
Hi, Isabelle. May or may not be a little nervous, but I'm gonna just do this. Let's see. So hopefully it's showing up. Okay. All right. Okay, gonna get mine. Sorry, I was. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm Isabelle. I'm a PhD candidate at University of California, Irvine, 4th year. I actually just defended my oral, so now I'm kind of in the phase of trying to get to do the field work, which will be in New York City, hopefully. I also wanted to mention that I'm presenting at the University of California, Irvine right now on the shared unceded territory of the Hashiman and Tongva peoples. I think that's really crucial because my work talks a lot about land grabbing specifically and how it plays out in the city setting, which I find is often not really talked about. I argue in this paper that gentrification is a type of land grabbing. And I also just want to thank everyone for being here and, everyone who has been organizing and stepping up to take over for this. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and get started. Alrighty. So in 2015, I was a student at Columbia and I interviewed a grade school teacher in West Harlem. And he told me that Manhattan is transforming into one large campus consisting of 2 universities, Columbia University and New York University. I also interviewed a housing activist who questioned the quality of schools in West Harlem and their effects on his daughter. He said, "I've been trying to get my daughter into a private school. She's 3 years old. The 3 best schools are in this neighborhood in the top 5% statewide, while all other schools in the neighborhood are bottom 5%. How can you have a community bordered 3 sides by academic institutions and have terrible schools?" So I found these 2 perspectives very thought-provoking, and they kind of inform my research going forward, which is largely based on participant observation, semi-structured interviews, and archival research. Unfortunately, I'm not nearly as skilled with the numbers as everyone here, but all right. And then, So Columbia, part of why I chose that site is because I went there and I got a sense of what was happening and the changes that were occurring in the neighborhood. In 2003, they started building their Manhattanville expansion to be completed by 2030. And they used eminent domain to seize that land. And this expansion is slated to displace about 5,000 residents and has also displaced a lot of locally owned businesses as well. So my work examines how urban universities such as Columbia are shaping smart city planning, how smart cities are becoming like university campuses, and how university administrators as well as housing and education activists navigate university expansions that disproportionately displace young Black and Latinx people. I seek to understand how education is being reconfigured as a racialized project for unequal power to justify land grabs by urban universities, and how smart city rhetoric besets the hegemonic dialogue of university, city, and regional governance. I'm concerned with how smart city rhetoric coagulates with the continued racialization of city spaces. So I see smart cities often portrayed as being politically neutral, but I see this as concealing the ongoing legacy of the theft of land and spaces from predominantly Black and Latinx people. Such land theft practices are rooted in decades of endemic racialization of space via policies such as the Housing Act of 1949, zoning laws, and more recently, eminent domain. So I wanted to touch a bit on the demographics. Unfortunately, I haven't gone to do as deep of a dive on this as I would have liked, but some preliminary findings are the fact that from 2000 to 2019, there's been a huge decrease in the number of Black people in Morningside Heights, which is where Columbia University's campus is located, whereas there's been a very large increase in number of white people. And I've also noticed that there's been an increasing disparity in terms of income. And I welcome any feedback on this as well if you guys have any advice on statistical stuff, because I'm pretty amateur at it. But so here, the top graph represents a more specific breakdown based on race and ethnicity. Kind of shows that at least currently West Harlem is pretty multiracial, and also has a large population of foreign-born people, many of whom are from the Dominican Republic or have family from there. So the core of my theory engages with university gentrification as a type of land grab to reveal how land grab is a marker of the broader global processes of land theft being carried out. I draw largely from anthropologist Keisha Khan Perry's work on land grabbing in Brazil cities, which she defines as state-sponsored racism and violence toward Blacks and the forced demolition of urban neighborhoods and the relocation of Blacks to the periphery of the city. I also draw largely from George Lipshitz's theory of the white spatial imaginary, which promotes a narrowly focused, racially exclusionary approach to managing city spaces. On the other hand, George Lipschitz introduces the Black spatial imaginary, which is an urge for the creation of new spaces for social relations. So far, I find that New York City is being constructed by universities via the white spatial imaginary, which, as an embodiment of white nationalism and an incubator for the reproduction of whiteness that depends on violently and systematically targeting the Black spatial imaginary. Columbia serves as a cornerstone for such projects as both producer of urban planning knowledge and a corporate entity with a stake in the segregationist state. So conducted via private-public partnerships, land grabbing does not occur in a vacuum, but is rather due to ongoing legacies of policies that render the city crucial to the state economy. A lot of residents and businesses continue to speak out against the dramatic consequences of eminent domain, organizing opposition at public hearings, filing lawsuits, and forming coalitions. They do face a great deal of difficulty because the ones who get to decide whether eminent domain is valid is the government itself, and so it's very much of an uphill battle. And here I jump a little bit to this other issue that I'm looking at. So when we think of smart cities, at least in the literature, young people are often considered to be the face of them, since they've been raised up, with to be hyper connected and digitally sorry, I'm nervous. Oh my God. Okay. Due to their experience interacting with a hyper connected, digitally driven world. But there is a trend of young Black and Latinx people being displaced from Harlem. So between 2010 and 2020, the number of Harlem residents under 18 dropped by more than 7,600, even as the neighborhood's overall population swelled by more than 20,000 people. According to the 2020 US Census, between 2010 and 2020, the percentage of children in Harlem fell from 22% in 2010 to 18% compared to the drop in youth population across New York City from 22 to 20%. And what's interesting is the neighborhood Columbia is in West Harlem, Manhattanville area was hit the hardest by youth population decline with a 31% drop since 2010. So amid these displacements, Columbia champions itself as being one to provide educational opportunities and other benefits that will come by expanding their campus. So during an interview with Columbia's Associate VP for Program Implementation and former Black Panther Flores Forbes, he claimed that there was a study done several years ago that identified young people of color, mostly young men, who are out of school, have not finished school without GED or diploma, not working, who might be formally incarcerated. He labeled them disconnected, affirming that Columbia's expansion would enhance their quality of life. Enhance their quality of life. Moving forward, my work will examine how unbelonging and destruction of predominantly Black and Latinx neighborhoods continues under the logics of smart city development, the likes of which allegedly promotes livability and sustainability in the city. This project denaturalizes policies that displace Black and Latinx people in the name of higher education, showing how socio-political and economic implications of university expansion shape urban citizenship and how urban citizenship is being navigated amid these changes. My project asks what technologies of governance and space making are emerging in smart cities and how smart cities are becoming more like university campuses. I also ask what purposes universities have in building the city materially and socially and acting as landholders, and what qualities of life smart cities in general bring to residents. And finally, how young people are being affected by our university urban planning and outreach simultaneously. This project also asks how young people, in particular, young Black and Latinx people coming of college age in smart cities are situated within and negotiating webs of global commitments to the optimization of land use as capital investment in this spatio-temporal moment. So that was my presentation, a bit of a hot mess, but that's okay. Thank you for listening, and I welcome any feedback at all. This is all very early stages, so yeah, thank you.
That was awesome and important. So thank you for presenting and sharing with us. I think I got my life together on this whole sharing thing. So we'll see if it works out the way I want it to. Yes, I do. Okay, cool. 2 years into the pandemic and you would expect that we get the hang of this stuff. So I'm presenting a project that is a part of a book project that I'm working on, but this is also like a breakaway article with one of my co-authors, Alexander Leisure, who's a grad student at Georgia State. The larger project looks at how the CBC developed their infrastructure over time and what strategic decisions at critical junctures in their development meant for where they are now as one of the more impactful, important like caucuses in Congress. It looks at the formative years from I argue from 75 to 85 was the most crucial point, the most critical juncture, because there were a lot of changes that happened in that time span. The Gingrich era reforms from 95 to 2000, and then once it was a well-oiled machine and what it looked like during the Obama administration and how they were able to leverage these various infrastructures in achieving their policy goals. So I start with a document from 1975 that was called the 10-Point Plan Towards a National Legislative Agenda. And this was a reckoning for the organization. In 71, in their first caucus dinner, Ossie Davis challenged them to come up with a plan. To give me a 10 Black commandments for you achieving your goal, and then act on that plan. And this 10-point plan was one of the things that they came up with. And in the meantime, they one of the things, point 6 was we need to come up with a way to both research and information, provide research and information for congressmen to shape their legislative behaviors. So they did so because they knew that Black members of Congress are the key sources of resources for information to communicate the needs, interests, and opinions of Black Americans, but they didn't have the capacity to do so at the time. And what they needed to do was create a different type of operation that would maximize their resources and allow them to do that effectively. So very quickly, the Black Caucus uses, they serve 3 roles, right? They serve as signals. They are the fire alarm, right? Here's what's wrong in the Black community, fix it. They're also brokers, and they serve in key informational roles. They are a function of disseminating information and taking in information and getting them to key people both within the caucus and outside of the caucus. And it also serves a supplementary role when committees fail to serve their duty in paying attention to Black issues. The caucus can supplement the lack of attention in committees by formulating their own means to gather and disseminate information. So the question of this particular article looks at how did the caucus create organizational features, and how did those organizational features help facilitation information processing in the hopes of Black interest advocacy. The argument is over time they created and formalized these institutions. Mike Minton and Valeria Sinclair Chapman call it these diversity infrastructures. And the information infrastructure is one arm of that broader infrastructure. Speaking of, and I think we got Mike Minton here right now, they argue that the infrastructure is deliberately designed by Black lawmakers to help identify, pursue, and coordinate actions on issues of importance to minority communities. They also allow for the sharing of information between offices, and they are crucial to keeping minority issues on the agenda. So they are, while they were abstract at first, they are now like concrete infrastructures and structures that the caucus relies on. So my job is to kind of bring to light how they serve these different roles, particularly in this aspect, processing information for congressmen. And I focus on 2 different structures, the CBC Foundation and the CBC Task Force system that they have. The CBC Foundation is an external nonprofit organization that conducts its own policy analysis and research as a wing of the foundation. The CBC Task Force is the internal aspect of the caucus's information infrastructure that they use to conduct outreach, hold roundtables, and things like that to gather information from what they call their Black talent experts, is what they call it in a lot of their documents in a lot of their archival work. So I think I explained that, and I also explained that. So let's talk about the task force for a minute. The argument for building their task force started around 75, and they knew that without doing that, they wouldn't be able to achieve the large scale goals that they had in order to support Black issues. They said it is difficult, if not possible, because they lacked an ongoing network. And now, because of the efforts that they did to develop that infrastructure, they say that the CBC carries out a majority of its work through the task force structure. Right? Each task force plays a fundamental role in developing and implementing an agenda for the CBC, and where the CBC's task force succeed, the entire caucus is victorious, right? So what does that mean for the organization? Each of the task force, their policy-centered task forces, are charged with carrying out any four of these different tasks, right? From holding member and staff briefings all the way through holding CBC special order hour speeches, which is a part of the story today. And we've talked about that, so I know we're short on time. So what I argue is that within the infrastructure, it allows them to specialize, right? It allows members to draw on their expertise, both to reach out to experts within the field and as well to aggregate and to process information. It also provides them a means to broaden their range of sources without having to sacrifice quality, right? Like, we know that information is costly. We know that it takes time and expertise to process, and the structures and the infrastructure that they developed over time, over the last 50 years, has gone a long way in improving their ability to do so. So to examine the utility of the caucus infrastructure, I examined 83 special order speeches delivered from 2013 to 2018. And these special order hour speeches are hour-long policy-centered speeches. And they're round robin tag team speeches where anywhere between 4 to 8 people will speak on a particular area. These speeches are capture a range of 14 different areas. And what I do is I look for any instance where they reference an outside source. So according to Karra McCray from Brown University, I would tag that, right? And there are a total of 268 statements in those 83 speeches that contain 139 different unique sources of information. 82% of the speeches delivered had at least one reference of an outside source, and the most uses of outside sources was in a budget speech where there were 17 uses of external information. If you're wondering what types of information they were, most of the time they relied on federal agencies, but they also relied pretty heavily on university research. So if you're wondering where we are, there we are. And the areas that use the most are law and crime, healthcare, economics, and civil rights, right? And in case you're wondering which universities that they use, if you see your university on there, it might be you. And if it is you, you need to tell me so I can holler at whoever your connections are, because I'm trying to get in there. And in terms of specializations, these are the types of specializations that they had, right? Agriculture all the way through broad specializations in terms of the types of sources that they were drawing information from. So the first measure that I'm looking for is accessibility, right? And I'm looking at it from the perspective of a congressman, right? So I have a 3-point criteria. First, if there's mandatory requirement. So like if a member sits on a committee and that committee in a specific agency reports to a committee that a member is sitting on, it increases the accessibility to that line of information, where I don't have any access to any of that information and I have to FOIA it to get it. But for them, it's easier, right? The ease of access to a source of material. So if it's paywalled, if it's easily searchable, things like that. And also, does the source regularly provide information? Do they provide monthly or annual reports, for example? So if they click 2 out of the 3 boxes in there, it's considered high accessibility. A similar thing goes with quality, right? Is it within the scope of the source's expertise to provide that information? Is the source highly regarded in terms of like ranking or like any types of evaluations for the source? And also, are they transparent about their data collection methods, the methodologies and biases and things like that? So if 2 of the 3 are clicked, then it's a high value, high quality source. So what that breaks down to is like this little 2x2, right? So your more high quality, high accessibilities are federal agencies, top think tanks, top nonprofits. Your low quality, when I say low quality, it's more so based on that criteria, not exactly that they're just bad, but like going to mom and pop grocery stores, small businesses and things like that, it's both harder to get because you got to find these people, and it's not easily going to persuade somebody that's making policy decisions to follow their information. So that's more so what we're talking about when we're talking about these quadrants. So this is actually what the network looks like in terms of like the types of issues that they're using, and the range of issues the range of sources across the number of issues that they have. And the model I'm using is an exponential random graph model. I don't know if we'll have time to get into that right now, but the variables that I'm using are designed to capture what's called homophily or similarity and prevalence. So the number of times something appears in the network. And for the homophily measure, what I'm looking at is if the 2 of the sources have the same specialization or quality, what is the likelihood of picking any 2 of those sources at random and they having connected to a particular issue? What is the likelihood that those sources have the same specialization or quality or any other characteristics? The prevalence is simply a count. So if I have issue J, how many of them are high quality or high accessibility in comparison to the total number that's prevalent present in the network? So real quick, the positive significant measure here suggests that information is highly specialized, right? This first on model 1, it suggests that they rely more on high accessibility information, so information that they can get, right? Which makes sense because information is costly, and if the information infrastructure reduces their cost, they have more access to that information, right? It suggests that they don't necessarily in model one focus on high quality information. While it's positive, it's not significant. But if you break it down into that quadrant and compare them to low quality, low access information, they rely much more on high quality, high accessibility information, right? So this goes back to one of my expectations is that the caucus infrastructure allows them to access a lot of information without having to, without having to sacrifice the quality. They're able to get good information and make it easier to do so. So questions moving forward with this project in particular, what happens under a hostile information where you don't have a lot of that, where like under Trump would limit access to his agencies and federal and the federal tools that they had under their disposal. Do these different sources play different roles? And if so, what roles do they play? And then breaking down the information gathering according to the different infrastructure that they have. So with information brought up from the CBC Foundation, is that used in a different way than information brought in from the CBC Task Force? With that, I know I'm over time, but thank you. You can reach me at any of these areas. So I appreciate all of you. Thank you. And with that, I don't know if we have more time. I hope that y'all were in there typing away. If not, can y'all share your contact information so that people can reach out to you and be in contact with you? But if there are any quick questions, I'd be more than happy to entertain a couple right now.
All right. I have a comment about Isabelle's research. And I think it's very important. And a few NCOPs ago, pre-COVID, I think we were in Chicago, there was a very hot and heated discussion about the Obama Library, and that it was going into Black neighborhoods and, regentrification, and there was a likelihood that many of the neighborhood people were not going to be able to get jobs at the library. And so I hadn't thought about until what you said that, but I mean, that's really having, my own university is, expanding, other universities expanding and taking land away is something that is very important. I'm glad you're studying it.
And I really appreciate everybody for coming in and presenting this amazing work. I'm looking forward to where it all ends up being published. And as a member of the exec board of NCOPS, I hope that you can submit it to the National Review of Black Politics. So yeah, shameless plug. So thank y'all. And I look forward to engaging with y'all in the near future. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.